I've had a rough couple of days. Don't know what's going on, but so after service, don't be mad at me if I don't come down there and give you a hug or greet you or whatever. I'll be leaving right after church and trying to recover from this. I don't know, have you noticed that I seem to start off majority of my messages with a question? Have you noticed that? I have. And it's a question that stimulates my thoughts, and I hope it stimulates your thoughts and gets you prepared for what is coming over the next 30 minutes or so. Excuse me. But my question to you today is, when you were in grade school, now I know some of you, that's a long time ago, and you might have trouble looking back that far, but when you were in grade school, what did you want to be when you grew up? What did you want to be when you grew up? Keep that thought in your mind. Did it change as you grew older? Probably so. Did you achieve that goal, that aspiration for that dream job? Did you achieve it? Or did you give up on it? I guess that as you grow older and hopefully more mature, this is just a natural thing that happens to us, is that our dream job will probably change a number of times. Well, this kind of pricked my mind, and I thought, I'm going to research this out a little bit. So I typed into the computer top 10 list of what kids want to be when they grew up. Well, apparently, it's a pretty popular question, because there was all kinds of websites that had lists that were there. But this one website that I went to, it had it graphed out by age. And it's interesting. We'll just sit on that for a minute. I don't know if you can see that or not. But I guess my immediate question when this slide came up on the computer, are you serious? 1 to 3 year olds? They got a dream job? Yeah. But I guess apparently they do. And just on the right-hand side, how those jobs, dream jobs for them, change as they go from elementary school to middle school to high school. Now, anything on there surprise you? I was kind of surprised that being a teacher was so high. But I probably shouldn't be. But I was a little bit surprised with that. Doctor was in there a whole lot. Now, one of the things that, as I was looking at this, I realized, and I'll ask you the question, what is missing on that list? You see nurses on there anywhere? Do you see a dentist on there anywhere? Why is that? And as I kind of dwelt on that thought, I thought, well, dentist, equals pain. The doctor doesn't give you a shot. Doctors are always nice and give you a sucker and all this kind of stuff. It's the nurse that pokes you. So I kind of wonder if maybe that's the reason why nurses aren't on there. And it was just interesting to look at this. So then I got going down this rabbit trail further, and I Googled, what do people say are the worst jobs to have? The worst jobs to have. And this, I found a top 10 list, and this was it. And none of them would be pleasant. Kind of took me by surprise. What's a whale snot collector? I mean, that doesn't sound good at all. So I kind of investigated that one. You know, there's people that they hire to fly their planes real low over top of the whales out in the ocean. And when they sneeze, blow out their blowhole, they're blowing snot and so forth. And their job is to reach out there in that snot and catch it in a container for testing. You got to be kidding. Who in the world would want to do that? I don't think any of you would on this list be thinking that would be my dream job. Well, you notice that I have left number 1 off of there. So, number 1, most undesirable jobs to have. I was kind of surprised. Okay, I'll put it up there. Well, tell us. Yeah. So, it's a motel maid. What? A motel maid as a most undesired job? I mean, I understand that. It wouldn't be a pleasant job, but I can't, looking at some of those others, I would put them above that. And motel maid. To me, though, I'm thinking that the most undesirable job that we can have is probably being a prophet. Being a prophet. What is a prophet? Well, maybe if you need to put a sophisticated title on that, it's a communications officer for God. God's communication officer. Well, that's quite a responsibility there now, isn't it? Actually, it's not the worst job that to have to do, but probably it's the loneliest job to do. We know that from Scripture with a lot of the prophets when we read about them. If you want to test my theory there about it being loneliness, try this week. Every sentence that you say in whatever conversations you're in, end that sentence with in accordance with prophecy. And just see how quickly people want to punch you in the nose. All kidding aside, though, no one wants to hear hard truths. It's not easy to hear them. No one wants to be told that they're sinful. Nobody wants to be told that they are rebellious. I mean, think about yourself. Do you like somebody pointing their finger at you that way? All kidding aside here, no one wants to hear the hard truths. Why is that? Because we don't want to change. And that's what hard truths does. All kidding aside here, there's an old story about a medieval Jewish astrologer. His name is Moish. And he prophesied once that the king's his favorite horse was going to die soon. And sure enough, the horse died in a short time after that. The king's favorite horse. So the king was angry with Moish, certain that his prophecy had brought about his favorite horses, death. So he summoned Moish and he commanded him, "Prophet, tell me when you were going to die." Probably immediately, no matter how he answered. So he carefully thought out his predicament to give an answer. And he finally did answer it. And he said, "I do not know when I will die." But he said, "I only know that whenever I die, the king will die 3 days later." Guess what? Moish lived a long life. Prophets, they have one job: to speak for God. And sometimes God has some pretty uncomfortable things to say to us. This week I read a story that was by Pastor John W. Rittenbaugh. In that story, he reminded me of my childhood experiences of playing in the snow up in Minnesota and up in upper state New York. And I mean, that was all we had to do. So we'd play in the snow. We'd ice skate on a rink, and we would get cold. Did you ever play that game? I don't know how much you have played in the snow, and I imagine for some of you, Kathy, that doesn't appeal at all. But we used to play this game, and I think we called it the fox and the hare. And what we would do is we'd get out in the field, and we would stomp a big old circle around, and then we would make paths that intersected in that, and then intersected with each other. So it was just like a big maze that was out there. And of course, somebody was the fox, and the rest of us were the rabbit. And so it was basically a game of tag, but you had to stay within that path. And we used to have a blast running around out there in the snow and in the cold. Well, Pastor John, this is what he wrote. When a person is freezing to death, he feels a pleasant numbness that he doesn't want to end. He just goes to sleep as he's freezing to death. He's comfortable. But when heat is applied, and the blood starts beginning to rush into those extremities in your body, it's painful. Believe me, it's painful. I remember that feeling, that pins and needles just constantly hitting you. Though it hurts, though, and believe me, it does hurt, the pain is indicative of a rescue, a cure, a sign to bring life back to those toes and those fingers. Bring life back into them, and so that they would operate the way they were intended to operate, the way God designed them to operate. And he continues. God sends a prophet to people who are cold in their relationship with God, spiritually freezing to death. And they don't even know it. The prophet turns on the heat, and they become pretty angry. Why? Because it hurts. When he is actually working to make things better. Nowadays, we have a tendency to view prophets as, maybe a more modern word, as a killjoy, as tossing a wet blanket on our fun. What if we viewed a prophet and the message that he brings us from God? What if we viewed that as a symbol of hope, a sign of hope? If God had given up on his people, if God had given up on us, he wouldn't send the prophet, would he? I mean, why? Why would he send a prophet if he's given up on us? So, that painful message that you hear every once in a while comes from God. And it is to help mold you into being the son or daughter that he wants you to be. If God had given up on his people, if God had given up on us, he wouldn't send a prophet. Makes sense, doesn't it? To you guys other than just me? So, if God sends a prophet, what does that mean? That it's a sign of hope. It's a sign of hope in a hopeless situation. Look, when you're lost, hope is what you need to survive, right? Today we're going to be looking at one of God's prophets, Ezekiel. Ezekiel faced a very difficult task. God called him to prophesy to the Jewish people at one of the lowest points in their history. The small nation of Israel had been under siege, and they were finally overrun and conquered by the armies of Babylon. The city of Jerusalem would lay there in ruins. The temple lays there in ruins. It's destroyed. And thousands of Jews were forced to exile to the capital of Babylon. And one of those was Ezekiel. Now, can you imagine being a refugee? You've seen the pictures of refugee camps. They're sad. They're living in poverty in a strange land. Think about it. Your center of worship has been destroyed. The community that you know is scattered. Your family is scattered. It's pretty depressing, hopeless situation. I mean, think about this. How would you rebuild your life if everything had been taken away from you? For the Jewish people, their life was supposed to be all about their worship. Their identity was God's chosen people. But they had forgot that. And that's what got them into this big mess that they were in. Now, they are a conquered people. Hopeless. Now, got a couple questions for you with that. Does this mean then that God had ended his covenant with the nation of Israel? Had the people lost their identity as a people of the one true God? Here in Ezekiel, God uses Ezekiel to answer that very question. To bring a word of hope in a hopeless time. So, God starts with in a strange way here in Ezekiel 37. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 14 here. He starts off with, "The hand of the Lord is on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, those bones, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of that valley. Bones that were very dry. No life in them at all. Now, if I was Zeke in this moment, I probably wouldn't say it out loud, but I would be thinking, what? This is a huge pile of dried up dead people. All that is left is bones. Why? Why do you bring me here? This is a picture of hopeless. Daniel Defoe is an author, and he wrote a book that is called A Journal of the Plague Year. And in that book, he describes the devastation that London experienced in 1665 during the outbreak of the bubonic plague. People who had the means, they escaped the city. Not very many people had the means to be able to do that. Others, they barricaded themselves in their houses. We know what that's like. Now get this. More than 1,500 people died each day. 1,500 people each day. Bodies were piled up in an open pits because there wasn't enough ground around to bury them, and there wasn't enough grave diggers to dig the graves so that they could give them a proper burial. Defoe writes that men roamed the streets at that time, prophesying God's coming destruction of the city. One of those prophets wandered naked throughout the streets, and he would chant, "Oh, the great and dreadful God. Oh, the great and dreadful God." I don't know, can you hear Eeyore kind of saying that with his attitude that he had from, what is that? What? Yeah, from Winnie the Pooh. Remember Eeyore? He's like, "Oh." Can't you just kind of picture that here? Oh, the great and dreadful God. But right here, I kind of wonder if Ezekiel is maybe thinking along this line. Oh, the great and dreadful God. Oh, the great and dreadful God. He's looking at these dry bones scattered in the valley in front of him. What a picture of hopelessness. And we don't know. Ezekiel might have at least thought, "Oh, great and dreadful God." It was a terrible time in Israel's history. It was hopeless. Something that we know about the Jews is that they insisted on proper burials for their dead as a way to honor them. An unburied body, which all of these bones were, was a sign of shame. It was a sign of disgrace. In this valley of the unburied people, just bones, shows that this is a time of fear and of heartbreak and of shame for Israel. Then we get into verse 3. And God asks Ezekiel a strange question. "Son of man, can these bones live? Son of man, can these bones live?" I mean, why even ask that question? What's the point? They are dried up bones. And here maybe we need to ask, excuse me, why does God try to interject hope in our most hopeless situations? Why does God try to interject hope in our most hopeless times? This is a valley of dry bones. But in this valley, we find hope. Remember the second part of verse 3? Sovereign Lord, you alone know. Sovereign Lord, you alone know. we find our hope in this truth. God keeps his promises. Always keeps his promises. Then we look at verse 4. Then he said to me, prophesy to these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. What? Ezekiel was confronted with a pretty challenging situation here. These weren't people with a future. These were dry bones. And God is calling Ezekiel to prophesy to them, to these dry, lifeless, fleshless, earless, dry bones. Look, it's hard enough to preach God's word to living and breathing people. But a huge pile of bones? What? Why? Why prophesy to dry bones? And I think it's to demonstrate again that the power wasn't in Ezekiel's prophecy. The power wasn't in Ezekiel's obedience. The power was in the promises of God, in his word. So Ezekiel begins to prophesy to these dry bones, and God begins to speak through him. To you, and make flesh come upon you, and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. So Zach prophesies. Verse 7. So I prophesied as I was commanded. And as I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone to bone. I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Verse 9, then he said, God said, prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, Son of Man, and say to it, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Come, breathe from the four winds and breathe into these slain, that they may live. We get to verse 10. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. So, the question here is, this isn't a crowd of people. This isn't just a mob. Scripture tells us it's an army. It's an army of people. Why? An army has a purpose. An army has an allegiance. An army has unity and power. An army has a goal and a mission to accomplish. And when we get to verse 11, then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up, and our hope is gone. We are cut off. God explains to Ezekiel that this valley of dry bones represents the nation of Israel. They were dead. They were hopeless. Seemingly cut off from the power of God. But they will not remain that way. Look, no matter how difficult the circumstances look that you might be going through at this time, no matter what the history books or politicians or experts say, listen to what God says, verse 12. Therefore, prophesy to them. This is what the sovereign Lord says. And what does he call them? My people. This is what the sovereign Lord says. My people. I am going to open their graves and bring them up from them. And I will bring you back to the land of Israel. In verse 13, then you, and again he calls them my people, will know that I am the Lord. When I open your graves and bring you up from them, I will put my spirit in you, and you will live. And I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it according. I have done it, declares the Lord. One of the things that we can count on, God will keep his promises. A promise given back in Genesis 12. Remember that one? God tells an old childless man named Abram and his wife Sarai to leave this country and this people and go to a land that the Lord would show them. And this is what God's promise is, that he will give the nation of Israel. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And don't miss this part. All the people on earth will be blessed through you. How would that happen? When God sent his son Jesus through the lineage of Abraham, we know him as now, and through the nation of Israel, he sent his son to make a new covenant with his blood that would be our salvation and would give us new life. We'd breathe hope into all people. Hopeless people. All peoples on earth. This is the gospel. This is the good news that gives us hope, even in our most desperate, our most hopeless times in life. And that is why you and I are here today. We are included in that promise, God's promise. I'm going to have one more story that I'm going to share with you. On September 4th, 2012, Alex Sheen's father passed away. Most people would describe Alex's father as an average man, but Alex describes him as a man of his word. At his father's funeral, Alex passed out these small cards. Passed them out to everyone that was in attendance. He called them promise cards. And at the bottom of each card were the words, because I said so. Because I said I would. His father lived by those words. He could always be counted on to keep his promises. In honor of his father, Alex challenged those in attendance at his funeral to write a promise on those cards and then to make a steadfast commitment to keep that promise. The people at Mr. Sheen's funeral were so inspired by Alex's promise cards that he began printing more and sending them for free to anyone who would request them. Today, Alex Sheen runs a nonprofit organization that does an organization that does character education programs. Character education programs in schools, in colleges, and get this, in prisons. He teaches about integrity and honor and character, and yes, keeping your promises. This organization has sent more than 11 million promise cards to people in over 150 countries. Alex also has a website, because I said I would.com, where people who have received a promise card, they can post their stories of the promises they have made and kept. One of those stories is from Elizabeth. She is a 26-year-old young lady that is a nurse in the United Kingdom. She works in an assisted living facility. She eats lunch every day with this particular patient who has dementia. Every day at the end of their lunch, the woman would become afraid that Elizabeth wouldn't come back to visit her. Her dementia made her forget just how faithful Elizabeth was to her. So Elizabeth took a promise card and she wrote on it, I promise I will come and have lunch with you tomorrow. And at the bottom of that card were the words, because I said I would. The next day when Elizabeth showed up for lunch, she found her friend clutching that promise card. And she looked up and smiled and said, you remembered. This truth we can always count on. God will never forget His promises. And His promises will always give us hope, even in what seems to be our most hopeless situations. God will never forget His people. Across every page of the Bible, God has written His promise. Because I said so. Because I said I would. There it is. Listen to the promises God made through Ezekiel. Made through Ezekiel to His people who were dead and hopeless. And they were cut off. He will give new life and new hope. He will bring them back to their home again. And He will put His Spirit within them. He will turn death into life. He will turn a valley of hopeless, dry bones into the hope-filled army of God. How do we know this? Because he said, I would. And this is why God always keeps his promises. Let's go back to verse 14. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken. And I have done it, declares the Lord. As we move forward in this year, in this day, remember that God is not done keeping his promises to his people. God is faithful. God's plans are eternal. And we, as God's people, adopted into God's family, his sons and daughters, can base our lives and our hope on the promises of God that he always fulfills. Let's pray. Father, I don't know what each one of us is going through right now in this world, but I pray that your Spirit has touched us this morning like it's touched me. That in our hopeless, difficult situations that we might be in this world, there is always hope because we are your children. That is what you call us, your children. So, Father, I pray for each one here now, that as we go forth from this place and as we go out into the world this week and so forth, that, Father, we would hear your voice say, you are my child. And Father, let that be the hope that ignites a passion inside of us, a passion for you and what you have for us to do. Father, let that be your breath breathed into us. In Jesus' name, amen.